Hello, everyone. It's an honor today having a conversation with Hamish McRae at CSA Conversation. Hamish is an associate editor of the Independent, a broadcaster, an author, and one of the UK's most respected financial journalists and commentators. He's also teaching at Dublin University. He has been a financial and business editor for major national newspapers, and he won several awards for journalism, including Business and Finance Journalist of the Year in the 2006 British Press Awards. He is the author of the acclaimed work on the future, The World in 2020, first published in 1994. I have read it. It was quite interesting. We will talk about the book as well. And since translated into more than a dozen languages, including Turkish. He's also writing regular columns on business and finance, as well as the intersection between the worlds and economics and politics. Hamish, it's such a pleasure and privilege talking to you today at CSA Conversations. Welcome to our talk.
It's a pleasure for me.
Thank you very much for your time. It's quite an impressive CV and career and achievements. And when I look at your career path, especially, an obvious subject would come to my mind about the path of the world economy during and post-pandemic period. What changes it will lead to, and what should basically governments, institutions, organizations can do to reinvent themselves. It's quite a challenging period for all of us all around the world. You always argued that the true wealth is as much measured by the ability to develop its cultural, intellectual, and social resources. And how do you think will all be linked for this new way of seeing the post-pandemic world? It's quite a long question.
Well, it's such a huge subject that I think that I find it most helpful to try and break it all down into bite-sized chunks. And so, I mean, first, there is a chunk about what does this do to the economic cycle. And we're having a recession of similar magnitude, in some ways greater than 10 years ago. So there's a cycle. We know we will recover. And I think that's the first area. And then there are other areas like the longer term social effects, the structural effects on different bits of the economy, and so on. But shall we start just by talking about the cycle?
Of course.
And I think there, I have a sort of, what's the word? A sort of simple way of saying this is going to be double as deep as the financial crash cycle of 08-09, but half as long. Now, that's a very, very crude approximation, but it sort of gives one some sort of feeling for how this will affect the world. And you can take a number. What is the loss of global GDP last year? 5%, 3%, something like that. If you look at global GDP after the crash, roughly half that in the first year. If you then say, well, how long? This year we'll be seeing huge growth. So therefore, the blow will be perhaps a year, perhaps a little longer for some of these slower recovering economies, but it won't be 3 or 4 years as it was for some economies after the last crash. And I find that comforting. And I think we can be pretty confident when all this is done and dusted in 5 years' time and we look back on it, that it will be an abnormal cycle, because all cycles are abnormal, but not an absolutely dreadful one.
We shouldn't be scared. We shouldn't be that much scared. I hope so.
I don't think we should be scared because, in a way, the deeper the dips, very often the stronger the recoveries. And what worries me more than the deepness of the dip is the long-term effects of the policies that governments have adopted to dig us out of it, in particular the free money just being flooded around the world, because I think that will create huge problems later on. The money has to go somewhere. At the moment, it's going into assets. We're seeing US equities at all-time highs. We're seeing a Bitcoin at 50,000, something close to that. We're seeing new companies coming onto the market with an idea that have never made a profit, and they're valued at more than $1 billion. So I think that our problem is not so much the dip. Well, of course it's the dip. And of course, in human terms, it's a catastrophe. I don't want, nothing I should say should diminish the human impact. But I'm worried actually about the measures that are used to dig us out and the social implications of all that.
I understand. And when we...
So shall we go maybe next to the sectoral implications? What do we know about that? What does it do for retailing? Here in the UK, we have seen the absolute destruction of the high street. We've seen online sales go from around about 20% to, at the peak, about 33% of the total of sales. That's enormous. It's 10 years of structural change crammed into about 7 or 8 months. And that will have all sorts of consequences for what do we do with retail space? Convert it into apartments? Well, maybe. What does it do for, what does working from home do for city centres? And what do we do with all these shining office blocks, if no one's going to them? And that, I think, we can see some things here, like the online retailing. What I think we can't see how long it'll last is things like working from home. But I think that we have to assume that there will be some sort of permanent change. My own view, for what it's worth, is we will find we still need offices, and we'll actually be going back to them for perhaps 2/3 of the time that we were. We'll be maybe doing one day from our laptops at an airport lounge and from our beach villas if we've got them. But a lot of the time we will actually need to be back in the offices. But we don't know. We just don't know. And I think we just have to look into our own minds to say, well, what we think is likely to happen, and then accept we may be wrong, and we just have to learn as the brakes come off.
I totally agree, and I know that even in your previous book, The World in 2020, which has been written in 1994, you always offer a structure or a framework where you just let readers think about their own analysis and ideas and to come up with their own solutions. I mean, you're not an oracle; you're a futurist, and you're thinking like a strategist.
I'm so glad you picked that up, because I feel passionately that my job is not to tell people what's going to happen. It's to give them a framework into which they can fit their own ideas. And as the ideas change, as things change, then we're not surprised by what's happening, because it's somewhere in there, even as an unlikely possibility. And I suppose I could give you one example which I'm relieved about, which was in that book written in the early 1990s. I did mention there was half a page on the dangers of a pandemic that we wouldn't be able to control. And not that I thought it would happen. I just thought we should be aware that it might happen, and not be surprised if it did.
Yeah, because they happened before in history as well. It's not a surprise.
Well, indeed.
So many pandemics happened because
Absolutely.
We didn't have this media. Probably we didn't have those communication channels. We were not aware how spread they were.
Though we were aware of plagues coming out of Asia and sweeping across the Middle East and sweeping across Turkey and then sweeping through the Mediterranean and then eventually heading up into Britain. I think the Nordic countries escaped from the plagues because it was so cold they couldn't, or there weren't enough rats to spread it or something. But we have got some historical experience of this.
And evidence as well. People, I think, forget about the evidence in even literary books, in the novels, in the short stories. We find traces of the pandemics from the history. They are written there if we can actually take the lessons. I'm also aware you have just completed writing your next book, a sequel to The World in 2020, and it's about the world probably in 2050. So
yes, we're hunting for a title for it. The working title is The World in 2050. So if anybody listening has better ideas, please let us know.
Oh, perfect. So in the next 30 years, it will be harder to predict what will happen, right?
Well, in some ways it's harder, and in some ways it's easier. I obviously went back over my last book to look at what I'd got right and what I'd got wrong. And actually, I start this one by saying, I hope I've learned from that experience. I'm very proud that I got Brexit right. I did suggest that Britain might well be leaving the European Union by 2020. I also did predict that there would be some kind of deep change in American politics. There would be a populist revolution against the established liberal elites and so on. So I feel I caught those two right, but I didn't catch technology right, because though I could see that we would use computers to talk to each other and they would connect, the internet existed, but there weren't any browsers. There weren't any search engines. And so I couldn't see that this would be the technology
it's very hard to predict
we would be using. So anyway, you get some things right, you get some things wrong. I think looking forward, it's easier in one way. We now have economic models that have talked a lot about the future. We've managed to, these didn't really exist until Goldman Sachs did the famous BRICS report. So that's a help. But that gives me a sort of intellectual framework to start thinking what might the various size of the economies be like in 2050. So there's hope there. What is harder is that we can't see what a bipolar world will be like with China as the world's largest economy, even larger than America. And that means that there's a period of great political uncertainty. How do these two giants manage their relationship? Can they manage their relationship? And so I in one sense, it's easier. The data is there and the data is better. But the geopolitics are harder and require making big judgments about how one thinks America will behave and how China will behave.
It's challenging, but I think the uncertainties nurture the growth of politics and economics as well. We are always scared of the uncertainties, but in this world of complexity, basically many things are uncertain nowadays. And
well, exactly.
We need to be maybe
You're
nurtured
exactly right.
by the uncertainty itself instead of being scared of the uncertainty, but yes, making use of it in some way.
Well, of course, and uncertainty is an opportunity. What is a risk on one hand is an opportunity on the other. There's actually a very good example of that. I mean, when the pandemic struck, markets collapsed, but that was also a wonderful opportunity to invest in March of last year for the fastest bull market that I think we've ever known. So I think that we shouldn't be frightened about the future. We should be cautious about it, aware of the social problems that rapid economic change takes place. And by the way, one of the long-term things I'm really worried about from this pandemic is the social impact on inequalities at every level. It's not just those who have assets, who've done very well vis-a-vis those who don't, but actually people who the young against the old, people in secure jobs vis-a-vis people in less secure jobs, people who are very well educated and are able to take advantage of it, and those who are less well educated and still struggling to establish themselves. So I think that one of the worrying aspects of this particular pandemic is the way it increases inequality, and we have to figure out how to cope with that. I think I'm almost more worried about the social impact than I am about the economic impact.
You're right, and it actually brings us back to that important topic. We all worried about the economic and political systems. They don't bring the social welfare, and they don't seem fair. So discrepancies among the people's wealth are getting bigger and bigger. So it becomes more and more impossible to bridge the gaps. And that's actually a worrying situation. Do you think, maybe as the final question, is the Great Reset possible, as Klaus Schwab mentioned in his recent book last year? Can we make the world fairer, more inclusive, less polluted? Is it a possibility?
Well, your last point about less polluted is something absolutely crucial, and that's something which I think all of us should be profoundly worried about. And I have written a chapter in this forthcoming book about how we have both to learn to live with climate change, but we just have to lean against it. And I think that there will be probably some kind of global action when we really realize deep down how worrying this is. And I suppose you could say that the pandemic is a template. The world has got together. All right, it's messy, but it has sort of got together to tackle it. And, vaccines all around the world are being developed, and we're learning from each other. So I think that you could say that the pandemic is a template for coping with climate change. Now, I think that, as a final thought, I think that I don't look so much to current writing, but look back to earlier writers. And the person I'm thinking of particularly is Edmund Burke, who was a British politician, statesman, journalist actually too. And he's probably writing in the 1870s. He was on the right side of history about the American Revolution. He thought that Britain behaved very badly and that it was better that America should be independent. He got some other things wrong. But his most famous statement is, that evil only flourishes. For evil to flourish, all it needs is good people to stand aside and do nothing. But the particular thought I find here that I find most comforting was his view of history as a continuum. It was a deal between the people of the past, the people of the present, and the unborn. And I think we should think of ourselves, anybody looking into the future, it has to learn from the past and has to try and think of ourselves as this moment in time, part of past history, but also having a responsibility towards future history and the people who are not yet born. And so I cling to that as a moral anchor of what we should do. And that's how we should see that pandemic, of course, but also see the next 30 years, that we have to get it right, not just for our children, but also for the unborn, the generations to come.
And as ordinary citizens, as ordinary bird citizens, what should we do? Like as individuals, independent individuals, because it's very hard to control other components, right? But as individuals, we can also do certain things.
I think we can all do certain things in our lives. And some of us, a very few of us, sometimes get the opportunity to do something which will affect lots of other people. But as a writer, all you just can do is sit behind your screen and peck away writing those words and hoping sometimes, just sometimes, that they touch something and help someone on the other side of the earth to frame their own lives a bit better.
They do touch. I'm sure they do touch, and they will touch in the future as well. Hamish, thank you so much for your time and for those great insights. And looking forward to your next book on the shelves, and then for your webinars as well, everywhere. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure talking with you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.